In the 1960s, Paul McCartney was untouchable. His melodies shaped a generation. His face was everywhere, from Beatles posters on bedroom walls to magazine covers across America. But today, fans are stunned. The once youthful icon is an octogenarian, still touring, yet nearly unrecognizable to some. How did this legend's journey twist from Beatlemania to the quiet life now he leads? Paul McCartney's story begins in the modest streets of Liverpool, England, where he was born in June 1942. The world was still in the grip of World War II, but inside the McCartney household, there was music. His father, Jim, had once played trumpet in a jazz band, while his mother, Mary, worked as a midwife. It was a working-class home, filled with both hardship and warmth, and from that foundation, Paul inherited the blend of discipline and imagination that would later fuel his artistry. As a boy, Paul fell in love with melody long before he had the tools to shape it. His father encouraged him to take up piano, and Paul soon began experimenting, crafting little tunes that hinted at what was to come. The guitar arrived later, but it felt like destiny when it did. His earliest songs weren't polished, but they had something undeniable: heart. And in a time when post-war Britain was gray and rationed, that spark of joy mattered. Everything changed in July 1957 at a church fete in Liverpool. A teenage Paul was introduced to another boy with the same restless ambition, John Lennon. John had a skiffle group called the Quarrymen, a scrappy band that blended folk, blues, and early rock and roll. Paul impressed John immediately by tuning a guitar properly and effortlessly playing Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock. That casual performance planted the seed of a partnership that would change not only their lives, but the course of modern music. In those early years, Paul was not yet the polished superstar the world would one day see. He was just a kid, obsessed with music, practicing chords until his fingers ached, dreaming of something beyond Liverpool's docks. He and John began writing songs together, bouncing ideas back and forth on long bus rides, crafting lyrics in notebooks that seemed ordinary at the time. Yet those scribbles would evolve into classics sung by millions. By the late 1950s, George Harrison joined them, bringing a fiery guitar style. Then Ringo Starr entered the picture a few years later, solidifying the lineup. Before they were the Beatles, they were just hungry young men, playing in dank clubs, especially in Hamburg, Germany. The Hamburg gigs were grueling long nights, little sleep, constant repetition. But it toughened them, sharpened their sound, and gave Paul a chance to hone his stage presence. Fans in those clubs didn't know it, but they were witnessing the rise of a cultural revolution. At this stage, Paul was more than just a bassist. He was becoming the group's melodic anchor. His ability to craft harmonies, to find a hook, to write songs that stayed in your head, these were gifts that set him apart. And while the Beatles were still years away from superstardom, there were already whispers in Liverpool. This band was different. No one in those small audiences could have predicted how colossal their fame would become, or how far Paul McCartney's name would travel. Back then, he was just another teenager with a guitar, chasing gigs and scribbling lyrics. Yet compared to the quiet, reflective current life he leads now, those hungry nights in Hamburg feel like another universe. By the early 1960s, Paul McCartney was no longer just a boy from Liverpool. He was one of four faces that the entire world seemed unable to look away from. The Beatles had arrived. When they landed in New York in February 1964 for their first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, the television audience was estimated at over 70 million people. That was more than 1/3 of the US population at the time. America was electrified, and Paul's boyish smile and effortless charm made him an instant heartthrob. The phenomenon was called Beatlemania. Teenagers screamed so loudly at concerts that the band sometimes couldn't hear their own instruments. Airports were clogged with fans. Magazine covers sold out if Paul's face was on them. Across America, young girls plastered their bedroom walls with Beatles posters, and Paul's name was scrawled inside diaries, as if he were the dream boyfriend of an entire generation. But behind the screaming hysteria was a genuine musical revolution. Paul's melodic instincts shone in songs like Yesterday, a simple ballad that became one of the most covered songs in music history. His voice carried a tenderness that stood apart from the raw energy of rock and roll. With John Lennon, he formed perhaps the most famous songwriting partnership ever, crafting classics that balanced John's biting edge with Paul's ear for melody. Together they delivered A Hard Day's Night, Help, Michelle, Can't Buy Me Love, songs that seemed to define the decade itself. The band's success wasn't confined to radio singles. Albums like Rubber Soul, 1965, and Revolver, 1966, showed Paul and the group pushing boundaries, experimenting with studio techniques and new styles. Then came Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967, often hailed as one of the greatest albums of all time. Its colorful cover became a pop culture icon, and the music inside was groundbreaking. Paul's fingerprints were everywhere, from the whimsical When I'm 64 to the majestic She's Leaving Home. At their peak, the Beatles weren't just musicians, they were cultural leaders. Fashion shifted because of them. Haircuts, collars, even boots. American teenagers tried to copy Paul's look, while record executives across the industry scrambled to chase their sound. Every Billboard Hot 100 chart seemed to be dominated by Beatles songs, sometimes with multiple entries at once, and Paul stood in the center of it all, the cute Beatle, the one with the sweet voice and the easy grin, but also the one who increasingly steered the band's direction. By the late 1960s, as the group's music grew more ambitious, Paul emerged as a natural leader. He drove projects like Magical Mystery Tour and later, Abbey Road. His bass lines became masterful, inventive melodies of their own. Songs like Hey Jude showcased his ability to transform simple ideas into anthems sung in unison by millions. In fact, Hey Jude stayed at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 for 9 consecutive weeks in 1968, a record at the time. To fans during this golden age, the idea that Paul McCartney would ever be anything other than a superstar was unthinkable. He seemed immortal, untouchable. The Beatles were not just the biggest band in the world, they were the cultural heartbeat of the 1960s. Paul's voice, whether tender or triumphant, seemed to echo everywhere. On the radio, in movie theaters, on magazine racks, even in the background of everyday life. It is hard now, decades later, to reconcile that image of Paul in the mid-1960s, the young man with a Hofner bass slung low, standing before seas of screaming fans with his current life today. Back then, he looked like he might rule the charts forever. Nobody could have imagined that the man, once cheered by crowds larger than some cities, would one day live a quieter, more ordinary life, far removed from the chaos of Beatlemania. For years, it felt as if the Beatles would last forever. But by the late 1960s, cracks began to show, and Paul McCartney found himself in the center of a storm he couldn't control. Fame had lifted them higher than anyone thought possible, yet that same intensity slowly pulled them apart. Creative tensions emerged as each member developed stronger individual voices. John Lennon grew increasingly radical, both musically and politically. George Harrison was writing songs that could stand alongside Lennon and McCartney classics, but struggled to get them included on albums. Ringo Starr quietly endured the turbulence, but even he temporarily walked out at one point. Through it all, Paul was often cast as the perfectionist, the driving force trying to hold everything together. His meticulous approach sometimes clashed with John's free spirit, creating a dynamic that was as combustible as it was productive. The breaking point came around 1969. Business disagreements, particularly surrounding the management of the band's affairs, grew bitter. Paul resisted the involvement of Alan Klein, the manager favored by the other Beatles, while Paul's in-laws, the Eastman family, were pushing for a different direction. These financial disputes added fuel to the creative exhaustion already consuming the group. In April 1970, Paul officially announced his departure. For fans, it was devastating. The Beatles weren't just a band, they were a generation's soundtrack, a cultural mirror, and a source of identity. Their split felt like a rupture in history itself. Headlines across the world screamed the news, and many fans refused to believe it. For those who had grown up with Paul's face on their bedroom walls, it was like losing a piece of their youth overnight. Paul's reputation took a hit in the immediate aftermath. Some fans and critics unfairly painted him as the villain, the one who ended it all. John Lennon's cutting remarks in interviews added to that perception, while songs like Lennon's "How Do You Sleep" seemed aimed directly at Paul's heart. The once celebrated cute Beatle was now dealing with backlash, his every move scrutinized in ways that often felt cruel. Even his first solo album, McCartney, released in 1970, was polarizing. It contained moments of brilliance but also a raw, unfinished quality. Some critics dismissed it as underwhelming compared to the Beatles' grandeur. The transition from being part of the world's most influential band to standing alone was not smooth. For the first time in his adult life, Paul McCartney was uncertain about his art, his image, and his place in the world. And then, almost suddenly, everything collapsed. The Beatles were over, Paul was isolated on his farm in Scotland, and fans were left with unanswered questions. How could the man who had once stood on the world's biggest stages, leading millions in song, now retreat into silence and confusion? His current life today feels far removed from that moment of despair. But in 1970, the future of Paul McCartney looked like a mystery. After the Beatles shattered in 1970, Paul McCartney did something shocking. He vanished into near seclusion. At his farm in Scotland, he withdrew from the chaos of fame. For weeks, he barely touched his guitar. Depression hit him hard. Friends later recalled him drinking heavily, doubting whether his career was truly over. For fans, it was disorienting. The man whose face had once appeared on every magazine rack suddenly seemed to disappear from view. But Paul was not finished. He began writing again, quietly, away from London's flashing cameras. The result was his first solo work, simply titled McCartney. Recorded largely at home, it sounded intimate, almost fragile, with songs like "Maybe I'm Amazed," hinting at the brilliance still inside him. Yet many listeners were unsure. The rawness felt jarring after the polish of the Beatles. It was as if Paul was tearing down his own myth, leaving fans wondering what would come next. In 1971, he formed a new band, Wings. With his wife Linda at his side, Wings became Paul's vehicle for rebirth. They toured relentlessly, starting small, sometimes even showing up unannounced at British universities to play lunchtime gigs. Slowly, the project gained traction. By mid-decade, Wings had conquered the charts with hits like Band on the Run, Jet, and Live and Let Die. Paul was back on Billboard, this time under his own name. For a moment, it felt like he had silenced the doubters. And yet, the shadow of the Beatles loomed. Critics often measured Wings against Paul's past, and the comparison was merciless. Even at their most successful, Wings were never granted the same cultural gravity. For longtime fans, the shift was surreal. Paul, once part of the most untouchable band in history, was now leading a group some dismissed as lightweight. His current life at that time was one of reinvention, but it carried a constant undertone of struggle. To escape comparisons, to prove he was more than a Beatle. The 1980s only deepened the sense of disappearance. The shocking murder of John Lennon in 1980 cast a long shadow. Paul, devastated, struggled with the public's perception of his grief. Critics accused him of sounding cold in his initial comments, though those close to him insisted he was simply in shock. The loss was enormous, not just of a bandmate, but of the other half of a creative bond that had defined Paul's life. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, Paul continued making music, but the headlines were quieter. Occasional hits and collaborations appeared. His duet with Michael Jackson, Say, 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 topped charts, but the mythic aura of the 1960s was gone. By then, younger generations were looking elsewhere for their icons. To many casual fans, Paul McCartney had faded into a softer, less visible place in the culture. The man who once defined an era had not vanished entirely. but he no longer dominated the airwave of Beatlemania had been replaced by a quieter, more uncertain rhythm. It is almost surreal to imagine Paul McCartney in his current life today. The same man who once stood on stages drowned out by the screams of Beatlemania is now in his 80s, living a life that balances quiet reflection with bursts of astonishing energy. While many of his peers have long since retired or passed away, Paul continues to perform, record, and surprise audiences, embodying a kind of resilience that defies time itself. He divides his days between multiple homes, an estate in East Sussex, a house in London, and properties in the United States, including a retreat in the Hamptons. Far from the cramped row houses of Liverpool, his life now is one of comfort and choice. Yet, despite his wealth, he often presents himself with an almost ordinary charm, photographed in casual clothes, walking city streets or riding a bike, as if fame has melted into the background of his day-to-day existence. His appearance today naturally bears the marks of time. Gone is the fresh-faced, cute Beatle who charmed millions in the 1960s. In his place is a man with silver hair, lines etched by decades of experience, and a presence that mixes dignity with approachability. Some fans are stunned when they see recent photos. "Is that really Paul McCartney?" they ask, shocked at how age has reshaped him. Yet others admire his refusal to hide from it. He still takes the stage without hesitation, proving that even an octogenarian can command an arena filled with tens of thousands of fans. Paul's career today remains astonishingly active. He continues to release new music albums like Egypt Station, 2018, and McCartney 3, 2020, show that his creativity has not dimmed. On tour, he plays marathon shows, often stretching beyond 3 hours, moving from Beatles classics to Wings anthems to recent material. Watching him belt out "Hey Jude" with a stadium full of voices is a reminder that his connection to audiences is as powerful as ever. His current life is not defined by nostalgia alone, but by a relentless desire to keep creating. Financially, Paul stands among the richest musicians in the world. His net worth is estimated in the hundreds of millions, built not only from decades of royalties and touring, but also savvy investments. Unlike so many stars who squandered their fortunes, Paul has preserved and expanded his wealth, ensuring security for his children and grandchildren. His financial stability contrasts sharply with the countless rock stars who ended in bankruptcy, making his current life one of rare sustainability in the unpredictable world of fame. Family has also been central to his story. He married photographer Linda Eastman in 1969, and their partnership lasted until her death in 1998. Together they raised children, lived through the highs and lows of his career, and built a sense of stability uncommon for rock royalty. In later years, Paul remarried twice, and today he shares his life with Nancy Chevelle, his wife since 2 careers. Stella McCartney is a globally recognized fashion designer, ensuring that his legacy extends beyond music. Not every chapter of his later life has been smooth. His marriage to Heather Mills in the early 2000s ended in a bitter and very public divorce, complete with tabloid scandals and courtroom drama. Yet, Paul weathered it, emerging with his reputation largely intact. Unlike other stars consumed by scandal, his life now is remembered more for endurance than for collapse. Attempts at comebacks have not been necessary for Paul, because he never truly left. Instead, what amazes fans is his stamina. Even in his 80s, he played Glastonbury in 2022, headlining one of the world's biggest festivals and standing alongside performers decades younger. Reviews marveled not just at his catalog of songs, but at his energy, his willingness to push himself in ways that most legends his age would never attempt. And yet, there is still a sense of mystery. For all his public appearances, Paul guards certain parts of his life closely. He has spoken about health scares and the toll of aging, but never in detail. Fans wonder how much longer he can sustain such demanding tours, and what his twilight years will look like once the stage lights finally dim. Compared to the hysteria of the 1960s, his current life is quieter, but it still carries the weight of history, every time he steps into the spotlight. It is almost impossible to reconcile the young man who once sang "All My Loving" to a sea of screaming fans with the elder statesman of music, who now sits comfortably on talk shows, reminiscing with humor and humility. But that is Paul McCartney's paradox. He is both frozen in time as the eternal Beatle and fully present in his current life now, a living bridge between the past and the present. When we look back at Paul McCartney's journey, it is impossible not to feel the sweep of history. From the boy in Liverpool whose father gave him a trumpet, to the global icon who helped reinvent popular music, to the elder statesman who still walks on stage at 80 and makes entire stadiums sing together, his story is both ordinary and extraordinary. For many, hearing Paul's songs for the first time was a defining moment of youth. Maybe it was Yesterday playing on the radio during a summer drive. Maybe it was Hey Jude echoing at a high school dance. Maybe it was the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, where families crowded around glowing black and white televisions and felt the future unfolding right before their eyes. Those memories are stitched into the fabric of modern culture, inseparable from the lives of those who lived them. And yet, Paul's story reminds us that behind every myth is a human being. The fame, the fortune, the screaming fans, all of it was real. But so were the doubts, the heartbreak, and the relentless march of time. His current life now, quieter and more reflective, shows us that even legends must grow old. Even icons must step back eventually. But growing older does not mean fading away. For Paul McCartney, it has meant continuing to create, to perform, and to connect with audiences across generations. Do you remember where you were when you first heard a Beatles song? Was it a moment that changed the way you thought about music, or simply a melody that became the soundtrack of your life? For millions, Paul's voice is not just entertainment, it is memory itself, a reminder of who they once were and the world they once lived in. So now we ask you, which part of Paul McCartney's journey shocked you most about his current life? Was it the fact that he still performs marathon shows in his 80s? Or was it the transformation from the fresh-faced Beatle to the dignified elder we see today? Share your memories in the comments. Tell us which Beatles song meant the most to you, and why. And of course, let us know, who should we cover next? Which star from the past do you want to see us revisit to uncover the twists and turns of their life now? Because every legend has a story, and Paul McCartney's is one that proves, even when the spotlight dims, the music and the memory never truly fade.